Your Royal Highness, Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In the PRIO Annual Peace Address series, which is celebrating its 10th year this year, we invite speakers from all over the globe, from a range of backgrounds and fields: academia, journalism, politics, activism, speakers who have insights to share relevant to the mission and agenda of the institution that I currently direct, the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO for short. My name is Henrik Urdal, and I'm the director of PRIO, and I'd like to welcome you very warmly to this year's Peace Address. PRIO is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. Since our inception in 1959, we have stood for a close connection between academia and practice. The cornerstone has always been excellent and innovative academic research, yet always with an emphasis on utility and relevance for policy and practice. The distinguished speakers we invite to give our annual addresses are all, in their own ways and from different perspectives, knowledgeable on matters relevant to peace and conflict. They are here to enlighten us, inspire us, challenge us to further our mission of working towards a world in which all conflicts are solved peacefully. This year, we are very honored to have Professor Steven Pinker as our keynote speaker. Pinker is a long-time PRIO friend and is Johnston Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. While specializing in visual cognition and psycholinguistics, Pinker has recently been drawing on a much broader and richer scientific tradition to challenge what he sees as a general lack of appreciation for the role of science in global progress. This has earned him the label of one of the most influential public intellectuals of our time. His 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, documented the massive decline in violence in human societies over the past centuries and decades, and offered some key explanations for this development. I'm proud to say that data on global armed conflict collected jointly by PRIO and the University of Uppsala played a leading role in his analysis. In Enlightenment Now, the Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress, published last year, Pinker engages with a much broader canvas. Using a host of readily available empirical data, he argues that health, prosperity, safety, peace and happiness have tended to rise worldwide. Not at the same pace in all locations and not without setbacks, but on the whole and over time, the world has become a better place to live for most people on the planet. Pinker shares his optimistic outlook with the late Hans Rosling, another great public intellectual. One of Rosling's mantras was that our failure to acknowledge progress is not first and foremost a question of ignorance. It is a result of prejudice. We simply fail to appreciate the level of progress among our fellow human beings, not least those living in the global south. The fact that the world has progressed in a number of domains does not, of course, mean that the job is done, that we can lean back and relax. What it does mean is that human ingenuity can enable us to overcome crisis, to solve global problems, and history has indeed shown us that this is possible. I look very much forward to hear you challenge us and enlighten us, Steve. But first, we have two other important posts. Now we will hear some introductory remarks by the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Torbjørn Røe Isaksen. Please.
Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, of course, I'm not here to talk about trade and industry. I'm here to, on behalf of the Norwegian government, wish PRIO very happy birthday and saying congratulations on behalf of all of us on the 60th anniversary. The institute sector is a very important part of the Norwegian academic sector, and it plays a very unique role in bringing together academia and society. And the institute sector and PRIO proves its value every day by being useful for the rest of us. And I can imagine, I've never worked here, but I can imagine that this is also a very exciting place to be, teeming with research, ideas, with debate. We all know of PRIO's high quality. Just think of the Center of Excellence, the ERC grants that their researchers have gotten, or how we never tire of listening to PRIO's experts analyze and make the public wiser through their media expert commentaries. And that's an important part of academia as well, reaching out. Though I have to admit that sometimes during very hectic times with an international crisis, I might personally get a little bit tired of just hearing an expert in all media channels all the time, but it's not due to the quality, it's due to the fact that we're a small country and we don't have that many experts. I can't think of a better public intellectual to give a lecture at the 60th anniversary of PRIO than Steven Pinker. Not least because of his spirited defense of science, free speech, and open debate. A defense that, sadly, I think, is in bigger demand now than in many years. Congratulations again, PRIO, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those kind words and inspired comments. Before we welcome you to the podium, Steve, we will also have a musical interlude. Ofelia Østrem Ossum, who will perform a gammelstev, old stave, from Telemark.
Så kvea for deg så lenge at du må tenke det tek ikke ende. Og så kvea for deg så fort at sans og samling skal gange bort. At sans og samling skal gange bort. Jeg kan ikke kvea, men jeg kan gaule, og hev du kaldgraut, så sko jeg maule. Ja, hev du kaldgraut, så set den fram, for her er jente som maule kan. For her er jente som maule kan. Vil du ha meg, så skal du få meg, og vil du ikke, så gå ifra meg. Ja, vil du ikke, så råd deg selv, for så ven en gute har jeg sett før. For så ven en gute har jeg sett før. han sliter ut på sko og sokker. Og mykje ut av oksun au, men ennå gjeng han jentelaus. Men ennå gjeng han jentelaus.
Thank you very much, Ophelia. And now, tonight's headliner. I very much look forward to hearing Professor Steven Pinker, what he has to tell us. And after his talk, he will be joined by Camilla Stoltenberg and Karl Moene for a discussion between the three of them. But first, Steve, please.
Thank you. Your Royal Highness, Minister, Your Excellency, Norwegian friends, friends at PRIO. Thank you for coming. Happy birthday, PRIO. PRIO changed my life. I used to study irregular verbs. This afternoon I will tell you about results of the intellectual journey that PRIO helped me begin. From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, defeated. Or, our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but they have much more trouble articulating what they do believe. In Enlightenment now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the Enlightenment. Namely, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a kind of bland status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do. The Enlightenment, I suggest, centers on four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you start to explain why you're right, why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. As a species, we are likely to generalize from anecdotes, we reason from stereotypes, we seek evidence that confirms our beliefs, and we blow off evidence that disconfirms them, and we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that we can try to understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment theme is that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. Science, moreover, provides not just technical know-how, but fundamental insights about the human condition. Naturalism. The universe has no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. Not because the universe has it in for us, but because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than to go right. Evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process which selects for reproductive success, not well-being. The implication was spelled out by Immanuel Kant during the Enlightenment that out of the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be built. The third Enlightenment theme, I suggest, is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other conscious creatures. Well, you might think, enhancing human flourishing, who could possibly be against that? Well, as it happens, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopia or messianic age. Humanism is feasible, I suggest, because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our blood relatives, our close friends and allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But the circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, such as education, journalism, art, mobility, and reason. Once you begin to engage in reason with someone, I can't insist that only my interests count because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Reason implies an inherent symmetry of interests. Finally, we get to progress that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, you might ask, if human nature doesn't change, how could progress even be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it's possible through benign institutions that allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to push back against entropy, that magnify the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln called them, like reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and vengeance. What do I mean by Enlightenment institutions? Well, some of them that we continue to enjoy include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, and a free press. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out, you might ask? Well, I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well. Because I have found that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means that you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, referring to the Voltaire character who declared, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, as it happens, Professor Pangloss was what we would today call a pessimist. A true optimist would believe that there can be much better worlds than the one that we find today. But this is irrelevant because the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of optimism. It's not a matter of seeing the glass as half full rather than half empty, or of wearing rose-colored glasses. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit that would be progress. Well, let's go to the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years. Then, with the development of vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy has increased globally to more than 71 years, and virtually no one guesses that it's that high. The escape from early death was uneven over regions of the world. It began in Europe and the Americas, but more recently Asia has almost caught up, and sub-Saharan Africa has shown spectacular gains. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low life expectancy was the death of children who are uniquely vulnerable and whose tender age brings the average down. In Sweden, for example, 250 years ago, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought its rate of child mortality down by a factor of about 100, and they were followed by other parts of the world, such as in North America, Canada, in East Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, which brought its rate down from 25% to 6% in just a couple of decades. That's still much too high, but the progress is continuing. Mothers, too, were in mortal danger when they gave birth. 250 years ago, 1% of Swedish women died in childbirth. Sweden brought its rate down by a factor of 250, as have other parts of the world, such as the United States, Malaysia, and Ethiopia. Health. For most of human history, the biggest killer was infectious disease. That is no longer the major cause of morbidity and mortality in rich countries, but it continues to devastate poor countries. But just in the last 20 years, there has been progress against the 5 most lethal infectious diseases for children: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. It takes about 2,500 calories to feed a young adult male, and for most of history, societies were unable to grow that many calories until the British agricultural revolution in the 18th century, where because of advances in agronomy, like crop rotation and better planting and harvesting techniques, later the invention of synthetic fertilizer, the mechanization of agriculture, the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, and transportation networks that could bring food from farm to table, country after country developed the ability to feed itself, including China and India, and here you have the graph for the world as a whole. Now, this would be a dubious form of progress if all of those calories were simply going to making fat people fatter. But in fact, they have reduced the rate of undernourishment, which just 50 years ago affected 35% of people in the developing world. That has fallen to less than 15%. First in Latin America, then in Asia, and now it's starting to come down in sub-Saharan Africa. And the most severe effects of insufficient calories of all take place during famines. Famine is one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and it could bring devastation to any part of the world. But as this graph shows, famines have become extremely rare, and they are now a consequence not of an inability to grow enough food, but an inability to get it to conflict regions and the most remote parts of the world. Prosperity. It is sometimes said that poverty needs no explanation. It's the natural condition of humankind. What needs an explanation is wealth, prosperity. And for most of human history, there was little advance in the ability to produce wealth. This graph of the gross world product from the year 1 to the present shows that for about 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high on the graph. Then, with the Industrial Revolution, advances in technology, the spread of education, the development of financial institutions like markets and banks, and the globalization of trade, gross world product has increased by almost 200-fold since the early 18th century. The great escape from universal poverty and squalor, as the Nobel economist Angus Deaton has called it, was again highly uneven across regions of the world. It first took place in countries like the US and the UK, but now South Korea has almost caught up. Chile has shown spectacular growth, and China and India, though still behind, are showing exponential increases as well. Here is the graph for the world as a whole. Now again, this would be a dubious form of progress if all of this economic growth was simply going to the proverbial 1%. But in fact, it has decimated the rate of extreme poverty, defined by the World Bank as $1.90 per person per day, US $2,015. By that criterion, 200 years ago, probably 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, and that has fallen to less than 9%. As a result, international inequality, the gap between rich countries and poor countries, after necessarily increasing with the Industrial Revolution, as some countries left behind the pack of universally poor countries, it is now turning a corner because poor countries are getting richer at a faster rate than rich countries. Now, of course, within rich countries, inequality has not decreased, it is increased, but that doesn't mean that rich countries have become indifferent to the needs of the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the young. Quite the contrary, for most of European history, European countries devoted no more than 1.5% of their GDP to social transfers, to education, to healthcare, to welfare, to old age pensions. But in the 20th century, every country went on a huge expansion of their social programs, so that today the median OECD country redistributes 22% of its wealth. It ranges from a low of about 20% in countries like US, Canada, and Australia to more than 30% in countries like France, but every country has an extensive social safety net. As a result, poverty in rich countries, when it is measured in disposable income, that is after taxes and transfers, has fallen in the United States from more than 1/3 50 years ago to 7%. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy in terms of food, clothing, and shelter, poverty has fallen from 30% to 3%. Well, and now a topic that is of intense interest to this very institution, peace. As a rough first approximation, one could say that for most of human history, the natural state of relations between great powers and empires and major countries was war, and peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. We can see that in a graph. This one is not from PRIO or UCDP, but from Jack Levy, which looked at great power wars, wars between the 800-pound gorillas of the day. And because of the power law distribution of war, the biggest wars account for the most deaths from all wars, big and small combined. What the graph shows is that 300 or 400 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, the great powers are never at war. The last time the great powers fought each other was the United States against China in Korea more than 65 years ago. Now, if we unpack that curve into its components, we see that over the last half millennium, wars have gotten shorter. There used to be things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. In the 20th century, there was the Six-Day War. Wars became less common. These are great power wars. Unfortunately, even as wars were becoming shorter and less frequent, thanks to advances, if you want to call it that, in military organization and weaponry, they became more lethal. Countries were better able to kill more people in a shorter period of time, until after the Second World War, where the deadliness of wars began to decline in tandem with the frequency and duration of wars. So if you combine all three measures, you multiply it out, you see there's a lot of ups and downs, but that the last quarter of the 20th century was the most peaceful 25-year period in half a millennium. If we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that before the decline of war, there were two unmistakable spikes in battle deaths centered around World War I and World War II, and these data are from, at least in part, from PRIO. But contrary to predictions that I grew up with, that it was only a matter of time before the world would see World War III, pitting the US against the Soviet Union and fought with nuclear weapons, and therefore even deadlier than World War II, we now know that the Cold War ended more or less peacefully and World War III never happened. If we zoom in on the period after the war, the one that has been documented by PRIO and then by UCDP, we see, whoops, let's see, here's the graph, there it is, that from a range of about 20 battle deaths per 100,000 per year. This is now from all wars combined, not just great power wars. The world has gone on a bumpy roller coaster with peaks around the time of the Korean War and Chinese Civil War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Afghan Civil War, and the Syrian Civil War. But still, the overall downward trajectory is unmistakable. And I was just told last night over dinner that the new UCDP PRIO data have come out, and that the next data point in this series is even lower. So the Syrian Civil War appears to have been a temporary reversal in the overall downward trend. So this has sometimes been called the long peace, and the natural question is, what caused it? There are a number of hypotheses. 3 of them were identified by Immanuel Kant, and I see that his portrait is hanging in PRIO building, presumably for that reason, namely democracy. And democracies statistically are a bit less likely to fight each other than dictatorships. Trade, countries that engage in trade are less likely to fight each other. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors, and if it's cheaper to buy stuff than to steal it, then plunder becomes less appealing. And an international community. And Bruce Russett and John O'Neill have shown that all 3 of these factors increased over the course of the second half of the 20th century, and all of them are statistical predictors of peace going forward. But in addition, there's been a big increase in peacekeeping forces by the United Nations and other organizations. This graph shows the number of peacekeeping operations since the late 1940s. More important are the number of actual peacekeepers, because an undermatched peacekeeping force can often be ineffectual. And we know from other statistical studies by Paige Fortna and others that even though sometimes international peacekeepers fail, on average they really do keep the peace. Another factor, another possible explanation for the decline of war is the outlawry of war that was first proposed with the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. It kind of became a bit of a laughingstock when World War II broke out, but it was really implemented seriously with the formation of the United Nations, so that for the first time in history, war is illegal, except in self-defense or with the approval of the Security Council of the UN. And in an important book, Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro have argued that this deserves a good part of the credit for the long peace, even though, of course, we can all think of violations. But they point out that ordinary laws, like laws against parking in handicapped zones, all the way to murder, people break those laws too, but it's still better to have the laws than not to have it. And they present evidence that the outlawry of war, the fact that, that conquest is not recognized by the international community, contrary to hundreds of years in which to the victor went the spoils, deserves some of the credit. They note that since 1945, no UN member has gone out of existence through conquest, and there have been virtually no annexations through conquest, and all of the claimed ones, such as most recently Russia and Crimea, have not been recognized by the international community. Finally, there are changing attitudes towards war. War used to be thought of as heroic and glorious and thrilling and manly, and peace was thought to be hedonistic and selfish and effeminate. That has changed, and now war is more often considered stupid, wasteful, repulsive, and cruel. Freedom and rights. We've all been alarmed by the recession of democracy in countries like Russia and Turkey and Venezuela and Hungary. Nonetheless, if you measure the degree to which a country is autocratic or democratic and count up all of the countries, then according to one data set, the Polity Project, the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. That from a handful of democracies a couple of centuries ago, today a majority of countries, for the first time in history, are more democratic than autocratic, and a majority of people live in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. And I know that there is a new and better data set, partly coming out of PRIO, Varieties of Democracy, but I only found out about it last night, too late to plot the data on the graph, and I don't know how closely that they would conform to the Polity data set. Now, people are often astonished to hear this claim because, as usual, people's impressions are driven by headlines, by all of the countries that have become less democratic, like Hungary, but people tend to forget how many countries were completely autocratic not so long ago. When I was a student, for example, the world had only 31 democracies. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and under the control of communist dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships, not fascist in the sense of what you call someone who's a little bit to the right of you, but really fascist. Greece was under the control of a military junta, the colonels. Most of Latin America was under the control of right-wing autocracies or military governments. Most of East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia, all of them democratic today. And the power of governments to brutalize their citizens has been eroding. One example would be the death penalty, which used to be almost universal across countries. But for more than 150 years, there's been a process of abolishing the death penalty. Today, there are 3 countries a year on average, abolish the death penalty. Most recently, Malaysia, just a couple of months ago. And if current trends continue, which they probably won't, but if they did, the death penalty would vanish from the face of the earth in less than 10 years. Also, many countries have decriminalized homosexuality. Just in the last few months, India, Lebanon, and Trinidad and Tobago have joined the list. Child labor. For most of human history, children were an economic resource that were put to work in farms and factories. About 30% of children in the middle 19th century in England, no surprise to people who've read Charles Dickens, but child labor was pretty much eliminated in England, the United States, Italy, and other European countries by the 20th century. This being a consequence of the overall affluence. Families no longer depended on the economic value brought in by their children. The fact that in modern economies there is a premium on education, so children are ultimately more valuable if they go to school than if they pick or plant crops. And a general increase in the valuation of the lives of children. And this is a trend that is spreading to the world as a whole, as we see by these graphs, commemorated in 2015 when the Nobel Peace Prize was shared by Kailash Satyarthi for his efforts at reducing child labor, which these graphs show have been partly successful. Violence, violent crime. In any part of the world that lives in a state of anarchy, there will be violent predation and theft, often triggering vengeance and cycles of vendetta and blood feud. In medieval Europe, for example, the average homicide rate is about 35 per 100,000 per year. Then with the establishment of kingdoms out of the medieval patchwork of fiefs and baronies and duchies, the rule of law was imposed across larger territories, and the homicide rate in most European countries fell to 1 per 100,000 per year. This is a process that tends to be repeated whenever the frontier regions and zones of anarchy are brought under the control of the rule of law. It happened again in colonial New England, happened again in the American Wild West, and even in regions, countries that continue to be relatively violent, like Mexico. They were 5 times as violent a century ago. If we zoom in on the last 60 years or so, we see that the United States and other Western countries, after undergoing a bulge of violent crime in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, have brought their rate of violent crime down by half. And though it's hard to estimate the crime rate for the world as a whole, at least by one estimate, the homicide rate has come down by about 30% just in the last 20 years. Not just homicide, but violence against women, such as domestic violence against wives and girlfriends, and rates of rape and sexual assault, which are down by about 75% in the United States since data were first kept in the 1970s. And children have become safer. Rates of violent victimization at school, rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse. Again, these are data from the United States, but I suggest that similar trends have happened in European countries. Indeed, we've been getting safer in just about every way. Excuse me. Thanks to the design of safety features in automobiles and the engineering of safer highways, our chance of getting killed in a car crash have come down by 96% over the last century. We are 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to be burned to death, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. There is, however, one major exception to the trend of increasing safety in the United States, and that is the category that statisticians call accidental death by poison, solid, or liquid. It includes drug overdoses, and here you see the American opioid epidemic, a terrible tragedy and a counterexample to the overall trend of increasing safety. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to die in a so-called act of God, a drought, a flood, a volcano, a wildfire, a landslide, a meteor strike, an earthquake, presumably not because God is any less angry with us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure, in the ability to predict many disasters before they occur, and in emergency response systems. And what about the quintessential act of God, the projectile hurled by Zeus? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is to be illiterate and ignorant. And for most of history, literacy was a perquisite of a privileged few, about 15% of Europeans during the Renaissance, for example. But European and American countries achieved universal literacy by the 20th century, and the world is catching up. Today, the literacy rate worldwide is about 80%, 90% for people under the age of 25. Not just men, but women. Whereas 250 years ago, only 6 British women could read and write for every 10 men who could. England and other developed countries achieved gender parity in literacy by the end of the 20th century, and the world is very, very close. Even though we're most backward countries when it comes to educating girls, Pakistan and Afghanistan are showing steep increases. And of course, we can associate that advance with the other winner of the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai. And in perhaps the most incredible, astonishing, difficult to accept example of progress of all, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-known documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores increased throughout the 20th century by about 3 points a decade, probably a result of advances in public health and nutrition, but even more so in the spread of education and in the trickling down of technical and abstract and symbolic concepts from technology and science and academia into everyday life. Well, have any of these measures actually made our lives better? These are all things that economists like to measure, but do they actually improve life as it is lived? And the answer is in many ways yes. For example, 150 years ago, the average work week in Europe and the United States was 62 hours. That has fallen to less than 40 hours. And workers on average today get 3 weeks of paid vacation, even more in Western Europe, which would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. Also, thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity, and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we forfeit to housework, which people say is their least favorite way of spending their time, has fallen from more than 60 hours a week to less than 15 hours a week. Because of the shortening work week and the amount of our lives that we have reclaimed from housework, the amount of leisure time has increased over the last 50 years, both for men and for women. Now, you can't help but notice that the gains for women have flattened out in the 1990s. And the main reason is that women today spend more time with their children. Contrary to stereotype, a single working woman today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mother did in the 1950s. So forget the 1950s situation comedies. The reality is that today is the era in which parents spend more time with their families. We also fork over less of our paycheck to necessities, from 60% a century ago to less than 1/3 today. Well, and the ultimate question is, does it make us any happier? There's reason to expect that it should. There is a strong correlation between life satisfaction and income. It is here it's plotted on a logarithmic scale for the obvious reason that an extra 100 euros will make a poor person much happier than it will a rich person. But nonetheless, the relationship holds throughout the scale. And it holds both between countries, that is, rich countries are happier than poor countries, and it also happens within each country, represented by the arrow impaling each dot. So within every country, the people who are better off are more satisfied with their lives. The expectation is, as the world gets more affluent, its people ought to get happier. Now, we don't have happiness data going back several centuries, but what we do have shows that in 70% of countries for which we have data since 1981, happiness has increased. Interestingly, the United States is not one of them. Happiness has decreased a bit, but the United States was pretty happy to begin with. And as you can see, here I have the data for Sweden. It turns out that the data for Norway are almost identical, and as you know, in many years, Norway comes out as the world's happiest country. And by the way, contrary to a widespread legend, Bhutan is not a particularly happy country, but many people seem to think it is. There's also another misconception, is that the world is seeing, despite all of these increases in well-being, people are committing suicide in record numbers. The reality is exactly the opposite. Suicide has come down by about 40% in the last 20 years for which we have data. In most, although not all countries, and again, the United States gives a misleading impression of the world as a whole. In the United States, after a pretty steady decline, suicide rates have crept up since 1999. Now, this is a nice occasion for me to debunk another widespread myth about human well-being, especially popular in the United States, which is many people believe that Sweden and to a certain extent, they believe that Norway have sky-high suicide rates. Turns out that that is false. And here are the data showing since 1990. This is Norway. This is Sweden. These are the data for the world as a whole. Norway's rate is below the world average. Sweden's is very slightly above. United States is slightly higher. I tracked down this widespread belief. I don't know if people here, in fact, I did hear someone say, oh, well, we Norwegians have a very high suicide rate. Not true. So it originated from a speech that Dwight Eisenhower gave in 1960 about the evils of socialism, that if you provide for people, they lose all sense of meaning in life and they kill each other, or kill themselves, I should say. I myself would have blamed it on the bleak existential films of Ingmar Bergman. But turns out that we don't need an explanation because it isn't a fact. It is true that the Swedish suicide rate was higher than the American suicide rate in 1960. But as the graph has shown, it has come down, and now the United States rate is higher. Well, has this progress come at the expense of the environment? And the answer is, of course it has. However, as countries become more affluent, they start to turn their attention to the environment. People's values change. They put a higher value on environmental protection. And countries have the means to afford more expensive and cleaner energy. We can see this in a graph for the United States, which shows that since the Environmental Protection Agency was founded in 1970, American population has increased by 40%. GDP has increased by a factor of 2.5. Americans drive twice as many miles as they did 50 years ago, but the rate of emissions of the 5 major air pollutants have come down by 60%. So the idea that you can have economic growth or you can have environmental protection, but you can't have both, turns out to be false. There are other measures in which, even with the many threats to the environment that we continue to face, where there has been progress. Because of the densification of agriculture, more food grown on less land, fewer forests have to be cut down, and abandoned farmland gets reclaimed by forest. At least in temperate countries, deforestation has fallen to zero and even has reversed. Deforestation continues in tropical regions, tragically, but it is down from its peak in the 1970s and 80s. And more of the world is being protected against economic exploitation. The amount of protected areas on the land surface has doubled from 8% to 15%, and the portion of the Earth's surface that's protected has doubled from 6% to 12%. And the biggest driver of environmental exploitation, namely human beings, contrary to fear that a population bomb was going to result in ever-increasing population followed by massive famines, the growth rate of the human population peaked in 1962, and it has come way down. And projections that take into account that as countries get richer, they have fewer babies. As people get more educated, they have fewer babies. As people move to cities, they have fewer babies. And as women become empowered, they have fewer babies. Project that world population will peak in 2070 and start to come down. So I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of optimism, it's a matter of being aware of certain facts. Now, how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, one algorithmic analysis of the emotional tone of the news that tallied automatically the proportion of positive to negative words found that over the past 70 years, period in which our lives have gotten, as I've shown, longer and safer and better educated and healthier and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and the summary of the world's broadcast has gotten glummer and glummer as well. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer, I think, comes from an interaction between the nature of human cognition and the nature of journalism. There's a well-known phenomenon in cognition called the availability bias, that people estimate risk and probability using their own brain's search engine as a workaround. The more easily an example comes to mind, the more available it is, the more frequent people judge it. So for example, in surveys, people believe that tornadoes kill more people every year than asthma attacks. In fact, asthma attacks kill about 40 times as many people as tornadoes, but tornadoes make for really good television. and asthma attacks don't. Well, consider the nature of journalism. News is about stuff that happens, not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, I'm reporting live from a country that's at peace, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. Also, and this is a point made by, I think originally made by one of the founders of PRIO, by Johan Galtung, that news tends to be about events, not gradual changes. The news could have run the story, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline because it wasn't a particular Thursday in October in which it happened, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty and no one knows about it. On top of this built-in bias that's inherent to journalism, there is, as part of the ethic of journalism, the feeling that only negative developments are serious journalism, that positive developments are human interest fluff and government propaganda and corporate PR. Captured in a humorous headline in the satirical American newspaper The Onion, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for rest of day. Well, if you combine the nature of cognition with the nature of journalism, you can see why the world is coming to an end and always has been. There's also a negativity bias in our own psychology, that bad is stronger than good when it comes to human emotion. We dread losses more than we anticipate gains, phenomenon of loss aversion. And we think about and feel bad events more than good ones, especially recent bad events, captured long ago in an observation by Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also market forces in the cutthroat market to be a prophet, a social critic, where pessimism sounds serious, optimism sounds frivolous. As the musical satirist Tom Lehrer put it, always predict the worst and you'll be hailed as a prophet. Let me conclude with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I suspect have occurred to many of you. First, you might think, well, isn't it good to be pessimistic, to be on our guards against complacency, to speak truth to power, to rake the muck? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course, we have to be aware of danger and suffering and injustice wherever they occur, but it's also important to be aware of how they can be reduced. Because there are dangers of indiscriminate, fact-free pessimism. One of them is fatalism. If you believe that despite all of people's efforts to make the world a better place, things just get worse and worse and worse, well, why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? Why throw good money after bad? In fact, if you're convinced that we're doomed, that if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence will, the logical response is, well, let's just enjoy ourselves while we can. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. There's another danger, and that is radicalism. That if you think our institutions are all failing and are beyond hope of reform, you'll be open to calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, in the hope that anything that rises out of the rubble will be better than what we have now. Or to empower a aspiring leader who promises, only I can fix it. Second question, is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, against a backdrop of incremental improvement, there can always be nasty surprises. And I've mentioned a number of them, or shown a number of them: the 2 world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, and the American opioid epidemic. And the world faces severe challenges that it has not solved, foremost among them being climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I devote a fair amount of attention to each of these in Enlightenment Now, and I suggest that we treat these as unsolved but solvable problems rather than as apocalypses in waiting. That we should address climate change by decarbonizing the world economy as rapidly as possible by a combination of policy, namely carbon pricing, and the development of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies, and that we should reduce the risk of nuclear war by denuclearizing the world's arsenals via a combination of just increasing the stability of relations between nations, so there's less chance of a provocation, an accident, a misunderstanding, and in forms of arms limitation and reduction, possibly culminating eventually in global zero, the total abolition of all nuclear weapons. A concept that used to be associated with folk singers and beatniks and eccentric professors, but recently has been taken up by some of the most hawkish of the Cold War hawks, including Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, William Perry, and Sam Nunn. Just a hint that these are not utopian aims, even though we are not on track to reaching them. One of them is the fact that there is an arc of decarbonization that already takes place in economic development. If you measure how much CO2 does a country have to emit to produce a dollar of economic value, then countries have undergone an arc. When they first industrialize, they burn lots of coal and wood, but then they shift to lower carbon sources, to petroleum, then natural gas, and hydro, renewables, and nuclear. It happened in the UK and the US, happened in China, though with a spike from Mao's Great Leap Forward when he forced peasants to smelt iron in their backyards, resulting in massive carbon emissions with zero economic output before China came to its senses. India has turned a corner, and the world as a whole is now producing more wealth with less carbon per wealth. Now, this does not mean, I must emphasize, that we are on track to dealing with climate change for at least two reasons. One of them is that this is carbon produced per unit of wealth, and we're producing much more wealth. The other is that these numbers can't just be stable or low, they have to go to zero. In fact, they have to eventually go negative. But it does show that economic growth is not inherently tied to flaming carbon. And a few people realize that how much denuclearization has already taken place, that the world's nuclear arsenal has fallen by 85% during its peak during the Cold War. Now, of course, there's a danger that this will be reversed, and we ought to push back against it, but it shows that the world's nuclear arsenal can be reduced. Okay, my final question. And this one is particularly poignant to me as someone who has argued for the existence of human nature. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism, as some critics charge, arid, or tepid, flattened, so that it just doesn't get people's pulse going? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, we know that secular liberal democracies, and we are now in perhaps the paradigm case, the prototype, are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, and they are the prime destination of people who vote with their feet. And I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, maybe even spiritual. Unlike hero stories, which are fictions, this is not just a myth, but it is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a myth that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity. To any creature with a sentience and the desire to persist in its being, for it depends on nothing more than the conviction that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, peace is better than war, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you, and happy birthday, PRIO. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for that exceptionally inspiring and engaging lecture, Steve. We will be hearing more from you very shortly, but first we will have another musical contribution. And in your honor, I should say, we have applied the progressive lenses also on the musical contributions. If you paid attention, you heard that the previous song was called Old Stave from Telemark, while this musical performance is called New Stave from Telemark. Thank you to Ophelia Østrem Ossum for beautiful performances, and I believe there are some flowers for you somewhere. Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Camilla Stoltenberg and Karl Moene. Camilla Stoltenberg is the Director General of the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. She is a researcher and physician who's played an important role in Norwegian public debates surrounding health and social problems and the way that these intersect in different groups. Karl Moene is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Oslo and director of ESOP, the Center for Study of Equality, Social Organization and Performance, which is a Norwegian Center of Excellence. And he has also previously been group leader at PRIO's Center of Excellence, the Center for the Study of Civil War, which was among the first Norwegian Centers of Excellence back in 2003. I'm very happy to have you join us up here for the discussion, Camilla and Karl, and also Steve. Hvis du setter deg helt bort. So I will go straight to the two discussions. We've heard Steve's tour de force about all the things that are progressing. There are some challenges still remaining, but what could possibly go wrong, Camilla?
What could possibly go wrong?
Or feel free to interpret that however you want.
Well, I think I'll start with my three questions that I would like to discuss. I don't think we can respond to them all today, but perhaps that could be a discussion following up on your wonderful presentation of your book. As a long-time admirer of your books and someone who's been inspired enormously by those books since the 1990s, I've been following sort of the increasing breadth of what you're looking at with awe. And I think it's a daunting task to address all the issues that you have addressed in that book, and I think you've done it in a fantastic way. But I also have some questions, and one question is, how come that it's all so clean? Because in my world, science comes with a lot of uncertainty, paradoxes, bad data that we cannot know whether we can trust or not. And I end up many times formulating all the things we need to do in order to get better data, have more advanced analysis, and actually be able to know whether what we see is the truth or not. So I think that sometimes, although it is compelling, and I do believe what you are saying, I also miss more of what you, in some ways, called nasty surprises. Because I think there are many nasty surprises that are real. It's not just something that happens and goes away after a while. They are real because they can take generations to overcome. So people are lost in those nasty surprises. They're lost in wars, they're lost in unemployment, and they're lost in economic recession. So that's my first question. How come your data, your evidence, and your analysis are so clean? The other question is quite different, and that is that since so much of what you say is or are things that I agree with, I have to look at what you don't say in order to ask you questions or provide criticism. And in your title and in the content of the book, you focus on reason, science, and humanism as core functions or core elements of progress. And I think they are. And I strongly believe that they should continue to be and that we should nurture them. But I do miss something that's very important. And I can use a very concrete example from one of your graphs, where you look at life expectancy. And if you look at that graph, life expectancy starts to increase long before you have all the medicines, antibiotics, technologies, etc. So what is that? Could it be that what you do miss, the last word that could have been included in your title, are those collective social forces, policies, social movements, mobilization, people's own activities in order to use science and link science to what can actually be used as forces to change the world and improve it. So that's the second question. Should there be another word included in your title in order to understand what are the important forces to provide progress? And the last question is even further away from what you have actually written about, and that is that I think that in promoting science as well and as strongly as you do, one should also look at how can science be improved? Because you do mention it several times, but there is reason for distrust in science. Now that science has become more transparent and we are able to see how much of it is waste, I think that we also have to provide a compelling story about how we can improve science as a system in order to use it to improve societies and to make new discoveries and to develop new technologies. So those were my 3 questions.
Thank you very much. You'll have a chance to respond
We can
afterwards. I'll give Karl a chance to also provide some initial reactions.
Can I just raise up, because I was asked by the organizers to be the attacking guy. so they were just afraid that he is against my nature, so I try to do that best as I can, but I very much want to sort of satisfy the wishes of the organizers. I liked the book, I liked the presentation, but my role is a little bit different. Enlightenment movement, as I see it, that was a progressive movement. The part of the Enlightenment movement that I know the best is the one sort of based in France. Adam Smith came to Paris, he met all these guys, Condorcet, Turgot, and Adam Smith was very much inspired by these. So Adam Smith is one hero of the Enlightenment movement, and that's also in accordance with in the book. But I think they have one thing in common, that they were really aggressively proposing reforms. For example, Condorcet, he was very much in favor of the welfare state. Turgot, likewise, they had social insurance schemes. They discussed this in order to improve conditions. So they were against status quo. They were not pleased with the situation, even though they had experienced progress prior to their discussions. They were not pleased. So they were eager to use the experiences and new ideas to progress. I think it's a little bit, I know many people who call themselves intellectuals at least, and they are not against progress. I think that's my first objection. I think that it's a little bit exaggerated that intellectuals are against the progress. Maybe you have friends, close friends, that are like that. But it's not so widespread as you think. And it's also a little bit like we feel a bit stupid if we criticize and say that we're going to. It's just as if we are not appreciating the progress. I think appreciating the progress, well, that's pointing out in the future that we can use this for further progress. So that's my first point. My second point is that you said pretty little about inequality, and there's a chapter in the book about it, and these things I'm going to say now, they are a little bit controversial. For example, in the book and in the presentation, there is a huge celebration of the elimination of poverty. I share that celebration. I think that is important to emphasize. Extreme poverty has gone down. But we measure these things with a very low poverty rate. It's just as if we fall asleep because now people have moved from below $1 a day to above $1 a day, or from below $2 a day to... it's very little. Even though from $1 a day to $2 a day, that's a doubling of the income. That's a doubling of the income. So this is my first thing that we are measuring it in an absolute sense. Adam Smith, for example, he would say that poverty, that is the absence, or if you get rid of poverty, then you can appear in public without shame. And of course, I think a person who goes from $1 to, say, $3 a day, which is a big jump, it's a big jump in relative terms, that person wouldn't be able in any country to appear in public without shame. So I think here is a little bit that we celebrate things in the bottom of the income distribution that is really, it's progress, but it's progress for such a low level that we should be aware of that. So we should combine this information with information about that inequality hasn't increased so much, according to my distinguished Steven Pinker. I think this is also right, but here it depends so much how you measure it. So take just income for individuals. Don't think about countries and income for individuals. Then when we measure inequality, we measure it in relative terms. Not as we measure the poor, the poverty, that we measure in absolute terms. But we have income differences, we measure it in relative terms. That means if all incomes in the world are doubled, then inequality stays the same. So those poor in India and in many African countries that go from $1 to $2 a day, they are in the accounting here. And you have the rich that goes from 10 million to 20 million. They are in the equation here. Then inequality stays the same. This is the way it's measured. It's only relative. If all incomes increase with the same percentage, then inequality stays the same. And these measures are used all over the place. They're used by economists. There's a Gini coefficient as that's property. But there are many other measures that have the same properties. They're just relative measure. And here's the punchline for this. Because when we measure progress for the poorest, then we so think it's a big jump to pass this poverty line. But when we look for inequality, of course, that will also be differences like this. The differences go up enormously. When you double your income from 10 million a year to 20 million a year, there's so many more things you can do that you couldn't do before, and you can command and you can dominate. But the guy in the bottom goes from $1 to $2 a day. That's part of these two societies, when it comes to inequality, should be measured identical, and they are not. And I think this is worth taking notice of. It can be combined in different. You can measure inequality in an absolute sense. Then the progress that we had recently is come at a huge cost for those who are egalitarians. They come with a huge cost of a tremendous increase in inequality. And this is inequality where the really scarce goods on the planet, positions and things like that, where those who get the doubling of the income on the top really get the command over them. So there's a change in the rights, in the abilities, the opportunities that are so different that we can't say that inequality has increased just a little bit by doing this. And I think this is serious. You, Tori Lind, I think he is here somewhere. And we calculated just an alternative index. There are many ways you can do that. So we measured, for example, whether countries become more miserly towards the poor as they get richer. So that means we try to see the ability to fight poverty. When progress happens, do the poor get a fair share of that, in the sense that we are utilizing the ability to fight poverty? And if you measure in this way, we call it the Miser Index. Some of you have heard it before, so you can think about something else. But if you do it in this way, then it's a tremendous increase in the world over, say, we can do this back to 1960, 1970, up to today, and there's a tremendous increase in miserliness. And this is worth noticing. I say the ability to fight poverty is far from utilized on any scale. So many people say that it's tragic what's happening in South Africa, for example, that after 1994, when they got independent or free of apartheid, So the things have really not gone very well. But here's the situation. The world as a whole are approaching the conditions of South Africa when we measure it by the gap between the non-poor and the poor and correct it for the amount of poverty measured in a consistent way with the same poverty line across countries. So if we are pleased or moving, the world is pleased by moving in the direction of South Africa, the richest country in Africa, with a completely unnecessary poverty, and ANC and others should be criticized for that, then we should celebrate. But I think you have huge challenges in this area. And I think really Enlightenment should emphasize these things as well. Inequality is such a complex thing that you can't have just one number, but you have to be clear what you measure, what it actually is. And I think this focus on relative income differentials only, I think that put us asleep, and we are not understanding actually what is happening around us. Do I have 1 minute more?
You have 1 minute more.
Thanks. I think the interesting things, I'm really inspired by your talk and reading your book and other things that you have written here. But I think so the next step is to combine things. For example, what role does inequality play for health policies in India? That is important. This measure just separately. Child mortality goes down on average in India, for example, and everywhere, as you showed to us. But what is interesting to see, are there in the local states in India with high inequality, what is happening to child mortality in these states? And what we have found, this is something I've done together with Andreas Kjelsrud, he's not here, that what we find, and we use actually some changes in the election districts to get variation in the data, that people live in the same place because they change the election district, they are actually moved to a different district and are in a new environment. And we can see the consequences on their life of that change that are independent of their behavior. What we find is put it shortly, is that first of all, health stations the building of health stations reacted not to inequality. States with high inequality or districts with high inequality build less health stations. But there is one positive good news. Even keeping inequality constant and increasing political competition, then the health stations are built. So political competition seems to control inequality in a good way. So I just mentioned it, not necessarily because it's such a good study, but it points in the direction what you're going to learn. We're going to combine things and then learn how democracy works, how democracy actually can come to grips with the bad consequences of inequality. And there are many other examples. I hope I can come back to that in discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both Camilla and Karl. I'm sure, Steve, that you would like to have a chance to respond.
And I'm ready to repeat the questions.
I've written them down, so I'll read them. Thank you both, Camilla and Karl, for penetrating questions that I'm happy to take up as best I can. So yes, the foremost question one has to ask about any data is, how good are the data? They come from so many different sources that I have to kind of subcontract that to the specialists in each one of those areas. Such as the data on battle deaths coming out of UCGP and PRIO, to take an example. So I choose the data to display where I feel that I could do my best to defend their practices. So in the case of, say, battle death data, again, taking it back to the immediate interests, there are arguments in the literature of should indirect deaths from disease and starvation be counted, or only people who are actually shot or blown up? Should there be extrapolations using some of the techniques of epidemiology to generalize from samples to a bigger picture? I like the criteria that UCDP and PRIO use, and they're too complicated to get into now, and so I've kind of cast my lot with them, and if they're attacked, then I have to suffer as well, and vice versa, to some extent. In terms of how clean the data are, they're not that clean, actually. I mean, I confess that I showed a lot of curves very quickly, but if you look at them in the book, there are a lot of puzzles. They're like, suddenly it goes down and then it goes back up again. What's that all about? Why do some countries show increases in the 19th century, others in the 20th century? So it actually is a fair amount of puzzles, even though for just about all of them, the overall and gross trend is overall in the right direction. And I should add that many of the claims that I make are about very large effects. In the case of war, orders of magnitude, number of zeros, number of decimal places. So you could be off by a factor of 2 or 3, and the effects would be the same. And likewise with life expectancy, if it goes from 30 to 71, and you're off by a few percent in either direction, it's still gone up by a lot. But anyway, it's absolutely true that has to be always interrogated. In terms of life expectancy, what actually caused it to start to increase? Again, this is a prime example of something that is less, or at least messier than I would expect. So vaccination was discovered, in the mid-18th century. If you look at the life expectancy curves, they really start to only increase in the second half of the 19th century. And as best I can tell, you'd be far more knowledgeable about this than me, but my reading is that it was sanitation that had the first and biggest push. But one has to ask the question of what concretely actually pushed those curves upward when they started to go upward. To what extent are these conscious policies or the result of activism, for example? In some cases, they obviously are, say, civil rights movement, women's suffrage, where you can see there was a protest movement and then the people in power conceded. But in other cases, there were improvements that no one particularly foresaw or announced, and they just kind of happened with lots of things all pushing in the same direction. The crime decline in the United States in the 1990s, crime fell by more than half, more than 3/4 in New York City, took everyone by surprise. And we still don't really know the best explanation, but it wasn't that there were people in the street marching for lower crime. Likewise, for the founding of the United Nations and the norm against conquest. There it was a deliberate policy. World War II happened. The leaders came together and they said, well, let's not do that again. How do we prevent that from happening? But it wasn't, and so it was kind of elite policies, although it wasn't from a protest movement. Some cases it is, some cases it isn't. Some cases these processes seem to occur. Now I don't want to say they occur spontaneously because that seems a little too mystical, but they may reflect lots of things that different people do at different times that add up and start to push something in a benevolent direction. Should science itself be improved? Absolutely, and always. And in fact, that the only reason that science is effective is that it always is skeptical of its own methods, its own findings, and that's why science works. If it was just authority, then it would be mired in error. And I can speak about my own field, psychology, which very recently has been plagued by a number of high-profile failures to replicate. Also true in epidemiology, which is, of course, one of your fields. And there's a great deal of soul-searching. What went wrong? How did we screw up? How do we prevent it from happening in the future? And that too, is absolutely essential. In terms of, let me turn to Karl's questions. It is, again, one of these mysteries of timing. It is, of course, true that many of the Enlightenment thinkers proposed forms of social welfare, which did not really get implemented until maybe 150 years later, starting, I think, in the 1930s as a probably a response to the Great Depression, but also in European countries after World War II. And it's not clear why there would be why there was that big gap in time, why there wasn't a social welfare state in the 19th century. Although I'm not sure that it would be. I don't think it's accurate to say that there's an increase in miserliness. Is that what you were saying? I would think it's the other way around. Not only was there the expansion of the welfare state in 100% of developed countries in the second half of the 20th century, even in the United States, which is kind of notorious for being stingy in social welfare, we got a pretty big social safety net. Even though politicians like Donald Trump are trying to attack it. But in some, again, I don't want to appeal to mysterious forces of improvement, but there's something it seems to be in the nature of 20th century governments that the social welfare state tends to expand even when the political ideology, as in the United States, pushes against it. So we had, just to be concrete, George W. Bush, a very libertarian right-wing president, introduced a prescription drug benefit. It was quite expensive, expanded the healthcare system. Obama introduced the eponymous Obamacare. Trump and Republican politicians have been just trying to kill Obamacare, and it just won't die. There is something that in modern economies that prevents too much backlash. And in addition, in the United States, there is a high and an increasing rate of private charity. And of course, one of the debates between the American way of doing things and the Norwegian way of doing things is Americans say, well, yeah, but we give privately to charity, you have the government do it, but we think it's up to the individual. And there are data that are somewhat consistent with that the rate of charitable giving in the United States is far higher than in other countries. Now, I actually am sympathetic to the idea that there's some things that the government can do better than private charity, healthcare being an obvious one. But the trends, though, are, although we don't have long-term data, the data are only for about a decade or so, but amount of charitable giving is increasing, amount of favors done for strangers seems to be giving, and of course, organizations like the World Bank, often demonized by many people, has set as its goal eliminating extreme poverty everywhere by the year 2030. Now that is, whether or not, they're probably not going to succeed, but the fact that that's even an aspiration would be, I think, unthinkable in earlier periods in history. Could someone in 1900 have proposed the goal of eliminating poverty all over the planet? Very unlikely. Back to extreme poverty, you're certainly right that what counts as escaping from extreme poverty is still poverty. We can even say it's still extreme. And the aspiration should be bring affluence to as many people as possible. And and of course, if one sets the threshold for poverty higher, then more people will be counted as poor. But nonetheless, it doesn't change, of course, the direction of the trend. If you count it at $4 instead of $2, more people will be extremely poor, but even more people were extremely poor 30 or 50 years ago. If you define as, with Adam Smith, if what really counts in poverty is not so much material deprivation, but social shame, although probably material deprivation is pretty important too.
They are related.
But so this is, I think, this is a profound question, and it's not clear that the stigma of poverty has increased. If you just think of two outward signs of poverty of now compared to, say, 100 years ago, the stereotype of a pauper 100 years ago was an emaciated person in rags with patches. Now, especially in the United States, poor people are fat. On average, that in fact obesity is a problem among the poor, and so being emaciated, your bones sticking out, is not a sign of being poor. If anything, it might be being overweight is more of a maybe a more sign of being poor. And now clothing is so cheap that no one has patches. And moreover, because signs of ostentatious wealth have become kind of déclassé among elites, you will often have very wealthy people who will be wearing Oxford cloth shirts or T-shirts and jeans and sneakers. And you often can't tell if a person is rich or poor by what they wear. They're wearing the same jeans, they're wearing the same T-shirts. You look at Mark Zuckerberg, he doesn't look rich. You look at Jeff Bezos, he doesn't look rich. Unlike, say, a century ago when we had the stereotype of the millionaire with the top hat and lighting the cigar with the $20 bill and so on. But anyway, it's an interesting question. The question of whether, I think you raised this indirectly, and it's one that I took up in the book, whether, I argue that I think a different approach to inequality than is common in the mainstream, although I didn't invent it myself, because it is undoubtedly true that in developed countries, inequality is increasing, in some countries by a lot, the United States, for example. So what should be our response? I agree that inequality itself should not be the target, that there are other things that tend to correlate with inequality that we should go at more directly. One of them that you mentioned is plutocracy, that is undue influence in policy because of corruption by wealthy people. But the reason that I think it's not the same as inequality is, even in the example you mentioned, if you go from 10 million to 20 million, you have a greater political influence. Well, that's not so clear. I mean, you can donate $5 million to a candidate in both cases and corrupt the system. And as we should be worried about corruption, and we should target corruption, transparency in government, limits to private contributions, that inequality is kind of a roundabout way of getting at plutocracy. Likewise, while I think that poverty is an essential moral concern, we should eliminate poverty, we should ensure that there's growth at all income levels. It's not the same as inequality in the sense that you can always reduce inequality by just destroying the wealth of the wealthy, and that by itself doesn't make the poor any better off. And as Walter Scheidel put it in his book, The Great Leveling, the best ways to bring down inequality rapidly are world war, radical revolution, famine, epidemics. Those reduce inequality, but they're not good things, because it's not inequality itself that should concern us. It's rather, I argue, how well off the poor people and lower middle class people are. The final thing that I'll mention, do intellectuals hate progress? Now, of course, that is a huge sweeping generalization, because the data that I cite, the arguments that I make, come from intellectuals, so clearly not in all intellectuals. But those 3 pages of quotes, I mean, those are direct quotes. And I find that it is very common, again, not universal, but that there is more among progressive intellectuals, a huge reluctance to acknowledge that there's been any improvement, as if that were to justify the establishment, the system that many intellectuals set themselves in opposition to. So that's the basis for that wisecrack, which admittedly was a sweeping generalization.
And something that you felt a little bit touched by, Karl, but you wanted to have a quick reaction to Steve?
But finish your sentence.
No,
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay. I think it should just be more debated, because I think these things are important. So that's why I raise it and maybe exaggerate. But so going back to the Enlightenment movement, sort of those who were located in particular in Paris in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So there were a huge discussion of, for example, that Thomas Paine, for example, that you should tax all rents in society that was not created by anybody. It was sort of the contribution of God or whatever, by nature, that there were huge rents. So you can tax that, and that should be given to everybody. No, it was given by who had the property rights and who just claimed the land, and they had the access to the rents. And these things were sort of went on. And if you sort of continue that argument for Tom Paine and Thomas Spence, the same, they were there to, and I think they influenced Adam Smith a lot on many of these issues. So if you look at world today, we not only have natural resource rents, like our country has a lot of natural resource rents, and we try to sort of expand the welfare state by the return on that wealth. But if you look more generally, there's so many things that comes from the absence of war, the absence of killing each other, that creates rents in society. How do we distribute that? That creates huge rents. Just think about it. Norway and Sweden had a world record in strikes and lockouts between First World War and Second World War. After the Second World War, we had the world record in the absence of strikes and lockouts. There were nowhere in the world there was so much conflicts in the labor market as in the Scandinavian countries between the two wars. But of course, this created a lot of rents. Surplus in society that wasn't there before, and how should that be divided? That's cooperation, that's trust. These things create a lot of surplus in society. Of course, that is something that belongs to everybody, and that therefore should also be divided much more equally. So that's a huge moral concern, in my view, that just like the natural resource rents that Tom Paine and others pointed to, these are fundamentals, but now we have distributed this according to merit, according to property rights in capital and so on, even though these rents are not created by that. They're created by the absence of conflict, by cooperation, by trust, reducing the transaction cost of that. And that's a fundamental, how big it is. For sure, it's 30–40% or something of national income that comes from these things. And you can do that by comparing periods where it doesn't work with periods where it does work. And that is, I think that is the moral, fundamental moral things that these are, we own in principle equal shares of that. So it's not that we take for the rich and give to the poor. The point is that these rents are there either because the nature created them, or we created them by cooperation, and therefore they should also be shared more equally than is actually the case today. And that's also for knowledge things. Progress in itself creates rents, but it is not necessarily those who made the investment necessarily really the true beneficiaries of these rents created. Of course, they should be compensated for the effort and also for the initiatives and their ideas and so on. It's not a society of perfect equality, but it's a society that takes these rents that are created collectively by doing something differently from killing each other, and it's a peace dividend in extended version of that term.
We are, unfortunately, to get that's fine, getting towards the end of the discussion up here, but I wanted to pick up on something you ended on, Steve, on the unsolved but solvable issues of climate change and of threats of nuclear war. I wanted to gauge your level of optimism, depth of optimism or realism, whatever. Of course, these are incredibly complex issues to solve in the first place, at the same time as some of the factors that you are emphasizing in your analysis, specifically the ability to create international cooperation, is under pressure, specifically in multilateral organizations. So how is it, how do you see, what is your expectation of our ability to actually solve these issues given the current political climate?
Yes, no, that is another profound question, one that really struck me quite directly, because as I was writing the book, Brexit happened and then Trump happened, with the book half written, and had to accommodate them in the book, because I do agree that these are forces against progress, against the international cooperation is increasingly going to be one of the essential forces behind progress, because problems foremost being climate change, but also migrants and refugees and cyber sabotage and tax havens are just inherently global. No one country can solve it. So if we're going to make progress, it has to be through international cooperation. And of course, that's exactly what Trump hates, and which a number of European populist parties also are pushing back against. So I think for one thing, we've got to make the positive case. It hasn't been, I think there's been some cowardice or laziness or complacency on the part of internationalists, liberals, Enlightenment advocates to make the case, like pointing out things like, hey, Western Europe used to have 2 new wars a year for 500 years, and since 1946 it's had 0. To what should we attribute that? Let's not be so quick to dismantle it. And other examples of making the positive case for what has been almost a victim of its own success. People just forget about it, and they just think that peace is a natural state. You don't have to ask the question of what yields peace, and prosperity and public health and so on. So the case has to be made. Part of the, one reason, I don't know if it's so much optimism, but at least the lack of the worst case pessimism, which is, is the future going to be a boot stamping on a human face forever, as Orwell put it? Is it going to be, Trump, and more Trump, and Orban, and Putin? Maybe not, because there are several long-term forces that push against it. Populism. One of them is that populism is much more popular in rural areas than urban, and the world is urbanizing. Second is that it is less popular with people with more education. Education is increasing. But most dramatically, there's a huge generational cohort effect, that the support for populism just falls off a cliff as you go from the World War II generation to the baby boomers, to the Generation X, to the millennials, to the Generation Z. And now you might say that doesn't matter if people become more populist as they get older, but we have reason to believe that that's not true. People tend to carry their political beliefs with them as they age, and it suggests that as the baby boomers die and get replaced by millennials, the popularity of populism will shrink, although it can do a lot of damage in the meantime, climate being a prime example.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm sorry that we cannot continue this discussion for another 2 hours. I think we would have not been able to exhaust the potential or the possibility of questions that we could discuss. There will be a reception that allows us to continue discussions afterwards, just around the corner. There will be finger food and refreshments. I would like, though, to start by close this first part by thanking the contributors. We have, for Karl and Camilla, we have flowers. Vær så god. And then we also have flowers for you, Steve. You may... And then we have, it's not your average carry-on luggage, but this is the PRIO print by Trond Nordahl that we only give to a very select few. So you will getting a version that is more travel-friendly, and if you prefer, we can even ship it to you.
Thank you.
Now, I will have to ask you to remain here until His Royal Highness Crown Prince Haakon has left the room, following then the reception in the canteen. There will be a Nordic buffet, including but not limited to stockfish of cod, fermented trout, deer, and the international prize-winning Norwegian cheese, Kraftkar. So welcome, and please stand up while His Royal Highness is leaving.